Hi, friends, and welcome to Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia's webinar to celebrate International Women's Day, where we're going to explore the topic Defending Tomorrow Women Using the Law for Climate Justice. It was a very special conversation, and we're just re recording our introductions because we had a technical glitch yesterday where I muted myself halfway through acknowledging country, and that's really important to us. So we just wanted to revisit that. I'm Karen Dyberg. I'm one of the directors of Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia. And ahead of today's conversation, I just want to acknowledge the custodians of the lands on which we meet. I'm on Wonjarabara country in the Yugambeh language group. I also acknowledge Yagara and Turrbal country where I work and Bundjalung country where I grew up. I know you're joining us from across Australia today, and we're encouraging everyone to put the country we're joining us from in the chat. I pay deep respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia acknowledges that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander laws and practices have protected country for millennia. When I think about climate justice and how to define that, I think I've been hesitant to share this definition because it feels very simplistic and kind of just personal to me, but I think it might ring true with other people, is that climate justice is so linked with racial and social justice because if we think of some of our kind of biggest fears of climate change and the world that our children might grow up in, the fears are around things like loss of safety, loss of our housing, our food security, our connection with family, and our culture. And so while some of those things are just things that we imagine, fears that we imagine might happen to us, we have to acknowledge that some of those worst fears have come true for people in the past and still today, not because of climate change or environmental issues, but because of racial injustice, colonization, um, and social injustice, where we would have, say, the money to fix these things and could potentially solve issues that are a lot easier to address than climate change, but that kind of racial oppression, social oppression have meant that that has already become a reality for people. And so that's why we're lawyers for climate justice, not just climate action, because we know that our work can't only be concerned about those imagined fears, but the real issues of injustice that have happened and are continuing to happen to people in our community. And so we just want to commit ourselves to working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this work. It was a really great conversation that we had. We think you're going to love it, so keep listening. We heard some inspiring speakers and kind of explored the work that women are doing and the emotional connection of contributing to the climate justice movement.
So, welcome everybody. I am also admitting people in the waiting room as they're spilling in. So, hopefully that's going to be okay. People can still join. So I'm one of the co-directors of Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia as well. I live and work on Turrbal Yagara country here in Meanjin. I'm a migrant to these lands. I arrived in Australia as a small child and I have British and Spanish ancestry. So I recognise also that I'm a beneficiary of a colonial legal system that continues to enable harm. And I know that I share an impulse with so many others to torch out the injustices that we see around us every day. So International Women's Day falls this year on Sunday, and we wanted to mark the occasion and take a bit of time to focus specifically on the work of women seeking climate justice in Australia. We can only provide a vignette in the time that we have. There are thousands of women and so much expertise also, I know, in the audience as well today. First Nations women are the first lawmakers, caregivers and climate defenders in Australia. We call out their wisdom, strength, excellence and leadership. And thank you, Karen, for that beautiful acknowledgement of country. The spark for today's webinar comes really from a project looking at women climate defenders in Australia. Not just their fight to win legal protections for nature and climate, but also the deep care work that they bring to that activism, care for country, people, and all species of life on Earth. And so while women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, they're also driving change and stepping into uncomfortable legal spaces that can sometimes feel quite hostile, unfamiliar, and adversarial. But this work and theme of care that women bring across society is something that we want to touch on. Care work is typically underpaid, undervalued, unseen, and yes, profoundly gendered. So that's that idea of social reproduction theory, basically, that society is not just running on paid jobs and the formal economy. It is held together and socially reproduced generation upon generation by care work, raising up the next generation, caring for our elders, people with disabilities, maintaining our households, supporting the fabric of our communities, and sustaining culture. And the kicker to all this is that in our capitalist modern society, this care work is actually an essential feature to the maintenance of capitalism. The spark and this research project that I'm kind of alluding to is the work of Professor Beth Goldblatt. And Beth has interviewed women all over Australia to understand why they've been participating in legal processes to support climate action. You'll have all seen Beth's portrait and her bio on the promo for this event. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today. Personal circumstances mean she's had to travel abroad to be with family at a precious time to mourn the passing of a loved one. Yeah, she really wants to be here, and we very much wish that she could be here with us. But she also wants everyone to know and gives permission for us to share the reason why she can't be here. It is quite a moment of life imitating research as she herself is stepping into the world of care. So I'm joined by two incredible speakers today. One is a lawyer, one is not, and each has a different climate journey to tell. And I'm going to invite each speaker to share their own thoughts on the topic of women climate defenders and also their own journey on climate action. But I'm just going to quickly reflect on some of the incredible Australian women who have been very recently on the front lines of climate litigation. And that includes very young and very old women. The incredible powerhouse of Anjali Sharma and her litigation guardian, Sister Bridget, who pushed to expand the bounds of the common law of negligence. Women testing consumer protection laws through greenwashing claims. Women lawyers challenging public assembly laws levelled against climate protesters in large gatherings. And women like Dr. Kate Wylie, our speaker, who led an organisation to challenge a government authority decision enabling the expansion of Woodside's Scarborough gas project. Gomeroi traditional owner Arnie Polly Cutmore, who on behalf of her people continues to oppose the Narrabri Santos gas project. And the wonderfully subversive Knitting Nanas, whose Nanifesto explains how they peacefully and productively protest against the destruction of land, air and water as they sit, knit, plot, have a yarn and a cuppa and scheme for their next subversive act of climate protest. So feminism tells us that this is no coincidence, of course. Women are drawn to these front lines, and it is an ethic of care and love that often takes them there. And so our speakers are going to help us unpack some of this by drawing on their own work, what propels them to step up and into the fray. And we would love, audience, for you to join the conversation by asking questions in the chat and sharing any comments and thoughts as we go along. Okay, so now to introduce our beautiful speakers. Dr. Kate Wylie is Executive Director of Doctors for the Environment Australia, and DEA was founded in 2001 as a non-profit organisation. So they're a membership organisation like Lawyers for Climate Justice. They comprise medical doctors and students who understand that human health requires a healthy planet with an environment that is free of pollution, rich in biodiversity, and that can sustainably provide for current and future generations. And we're also very lucky to have with us Ariane Wilkinson, who is the Senior Manager, Climate and Energy Policy at WWF Australia. So Ariane is a very experienced lawyer and is a former climate litigator. And in her current role, she advocates directly to ministers and decision makers to win strong climate laws and policies. So I'm going to hand over first to Kate, and then we will hear from Ariane. Thank you, Kate.
Oh, thank you, Monica, and hello, everybody. How lovely to see so many people here taking the time to come to this webinar today and just reflecting on all the various cases that you just referred to, Monica. I feel very privileged to be able to speak today because when I think of the Knitting Nanas, or I think of Auntie Polly, or I think of, Raylene Cooper, and all the, the case law and the Torres Strait 8 and all the other climate litigants out there, I feel very, very quite chuffed that I'm speaking today, knowing that I am amongst such a pantheon of stars doing so much great work. I do have some slides, but I'll try not to make this a death by PowerPoint kind of presentation. And I'm assuming everybody can see that. So yeah, my name is Kate Wylie. I do acknowledge country. I live and work on Ghana land. So hello to a group of people in Ghana is Namani. So Namani to you all. And I just want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also acknowledge the planetary health emergency. We're in the danger zone for climate change, biodiversity loss, and other planetary health boundaries, mainly due to our human-made actions, notably fossil fuel combustion and deforestation. In the discussion, we're going to go on and talk a lot more about this today, but really the way I see the planetary health emergency is very much an extension of toxic masculinity, where that sort of extractive, power-based culture of one group having all the rights and everybody else being on the receiving end of their destruction has caused this massive global mess that we're in. As you've said, I'm from Doctors for the Environment. We're doctors and medical students who volunteer our time using our capacity to try and make our planet healthy. This is a photo of us just when we stood outside court for the judicial review that I'm going to talk about in a sec. And I also just want to share a picture of my dog. This is Ella, and the reason why Ella's there is that, we're going to be focusing on the human impacts of what we're doing to our planet today. But I always like to remember that what we're doing to our planet affects every living thing, every plant, every animal, every fungus, and, every algae. I'm in South Australia, the algal bloom's big down here. And sometimes we can get a bit cynical about humanity. And I just ask that when we have those cynical moments, let's remember the beauty of our natural world and our need to care for country and how much that extends to all of nature. All right, so last year, Doctors for the Environment, with the great help of the Environment Defenders Office, undertook a judicial review against NOPSEMA, so the government regulators' approval of Woodside's environmental plan for the Scarborough offshore gas project. And we lodged that case on the 2nd of May, which some of you may remember was the day before the election. So it all happened while there was a lot of other things going on, but basically we stood up to Woodside Scarborough project. What we were basically saying was that any environmental plan, according to NOPSEMA, the whole point is to ensure that the greenhouse gas activity is contained, that the environmental plan should be consistent with principles of ecologically sustainable development, that the emissions should be as low as reasonably practicable, whatever that means, and at an acceptable level. When we look at Scarborough, which is slated to release 878 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions during its lifetime, we felt that that didn't quite meet the criteria that the EP plans are meant to have. And so we contended their plan was vague, didn't reduce emissions to acceptable levels, didn't reach ALARP, or as our barrister put it in court, Woodside's plan was meaningless corporate puffery, and therefore NOPSEMA should never have approved it. Also in the plan, Woodside states that the methane from Scarborough could displace more carbon intensive forms of energy in the export market. So basically that concept that them selling gas offshore would displace coal. And that's known as the displacement assumption. And then if it was found after a year or so that it wasn't working, then Woodside would therefore put in extra management measures. And so, this all seemed a little bit thin to DEA. And we had this opportunity to, mount this judicial review. And so we took it. We thought, well, we can, so let's have a go. The first step in that was that we needed to get a maximum cost order. DEA, we might be run by doctors, but we're a small not-for-profit. We've got an annual turnover of $600,000 per year. We do not have spare cash lying around, and certainly not enough money to go up against the might and power of Woodside, who has an annual turnover of 20 billion Australian per year, nor NOPSEMA, which is a government regulator, so they've got very deep pockets. So the first step in the process for us was to get the judicial review. And we were very lucky we attained that, and quite proud because we created some precedents there, where it's the first time the federal court granted a maximum cost order for an environmental group. So that was a tick. We're very happy with that. The second thing was that we had to prove that we were relevant. So as a room of lawyers, you'd understand that more than I did going into this thing. But during court, Woodside very much tried to say that DEA was not relevant, that therefore, and that if the court found we weren't relevant, then any of the arguments that came after that would not need to have been heard. Fortunately for us, we'd already established that we were relevant as far as NOPSEMA is concerned under this sort of Regulation 25 in the application of the EPBC Act for NOPSEMA, basically saying that our function of caring for health by caring for the environment would be affected by the environmental plan. And then, of course, we all turned up to court trying to look particularly relevant and suitable, and we were granted that. So that was wonderful. But unfortunately, the judge upheld NOPSEMA's approval of the environmental plan for Scarborough, saying that they could be reasonably satisfied that Woodside's plan did what it was purported to do, and which was quite a blow for us. And so we feel like we had like a partial success. We got this maximum cost order, we were seen as relevant, but the environmental plan was upheld. For us, I think the most sort of interesting part of it was this judgment by Justice Sean McElwain, who said in his summation that it is not for this court to adjudicate on the existential threat posed by climate change caused by anthropogenic CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. And, I'm going to stop sharing there and start speaking more. For me, that was like, if he can't do it, then who can? And, from there, I think that talks to the stepwise process of legal arguments. But also, for me, it's this, let's walk back to Canberra then and say, because the people that really can make the difference are our politicians, the people who make the laws. And obviously, since then, we've had the EPBC Act reforms, which I don't think have reformed things anywhere near well enough, and would not be sufficient to stop NOPSEMA approving the environmental plan again if we went this time round. So, I can talk further now about how that felt for me going through this process, or we can do that in discussion, whatever people are comfortable with. I'll just get a nod or a shake from you, Monica.
Oh, well, a little bit. It would to expand a little bit on what it was like for you as, I guess, a woman leader. That'd be great.
Absolutely. So I suppose the thing was for us is that we had this opportunity to make a difference. And I think, you look at the might and power of the fossil fuel industry, who are a malignant cancer on our world and are causing such immense harm to us all. And I think that if I have an opportunity to do something about it, then I should. And I know that, I think we know in DEA, and we went in with our eyes well open. We were told we had a reasonable chance of success, not it's not going to be a lay down misère. We have a reasonable chance, but we took it because we thought it was the ethical, responsible thing to do. We know how dangerous fossil fuels are. We see people being harmed all the time. We see it as an abuse of power. We're a relatively powerful group. As doctors, we have, we're a trusted voice and, we're relatively articulate and able to kind of put ourselves out there. So then we should, because we can, because we know that there are so many people out there that have no voice, that can't. And so, what would we be if we just sat back and watched and were complacent in this? And I think that's fundamental where DEA comes from. We try very hard. We really try and be bigger than as I said, we're a small organisation. Um, yeah, so the opportunity presented ourselves and we could not pass it by. It was scary, like it is not, you can't say it's not scary undertaking climate litigation, and the day before a federal election, I've got reporters calling me saying, you're going after Woodside, what's that like? That sort of thing. And, being under public scrutiny and, being put in the spotlight like that. But, we have to be brave and have courage together. And I look around and see so many people being brave and having such courage. And I just think, I've got to do that too. And, we talk about care. I have an 18-year-old. If I'm not brave for her, then I'm failing in my parenthood, I think. And so, yeah, I was glad that the rest of DEA certainly got behind us. And we've had a lot of support from the community. And yeah, we'd do it again, but it certainly was a wild ride. I'll leave it there.
Ah, amazing. And I don't know if you saw, but we were getting a lot of love hearts coming across the screen, Kate.
Yeah, it was
Really, thank
lovely.
you. Just so authentic and from the heart about what really matters and what drives you. And that is probably the perfect way to pass on to Ariane, who I know has been also very inspired by some of the work of DEA and other orgs. So over to you, Ariane.
Thanks so much, Monica, and thanks to Lawyers for Climate Justice for having me today. It was a real honour to be asked to speak, especially considering I have stepped back from legal practice for the last 5 years after a decade on the tools. Good day, everybody. So glad to have this chat with friends and colleagues today. I'm in Meanjin, so I'm on Turrbal and Yago land, and I acknowledge those who've cared for this land since time immemorial. And as Monica said, my name's Ariane Wilkinson. I'm a lawyer by trade, non-practicing now. I'm a policy advocate at an organisation called WWF-Australia, which many of you will know from the panda logo. And yeah, I've had a great privilege in my career to use the law to seek to achieve climate action, and sometimes to use the law to seek to achieve climate justice as well, which I think from the introductions we've had today and just from that stunning example from Kate, I would hope we could all agree that it's actually climate justice that creates the durable change that will save life. So I've been invited to just give a little bit of a chat about my story, about what motivates me, and about some of the change I've had the opportunity to be a part of. I don't have a slide deck. I have props, so I'll see if they work. I'll see if they add value to this storytelling. Um, and just to speak to a few of the themes. I think to start with, there's a quote that I adopted from Mary Robinson, who used to be the president of Ireland, who does a lot around climate justice, and I amended it a bit. It's climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. That's her quote. She's written a whole book about it, which I recommend. And I thought about it a lot and I'm like, okay, climate change is a man-made problem with an intersectional feminist solution, because those of us lucky enough to work, like to live in a safe democracy, to advocate, we hang out and we see the changes. We're like, well, just white feminism isn't going to save us. We need First Nations leadership. We need more diverse people in rooms, more diverse people in decision making. So that's my shorthand way of saying, climate change at its core, and I think Kate illustrated this extraordinarily well, is a problem of power. It is not a problem of science, law, information. It's not even as, Professor Ross Garnaut, the great economist, says, it's a wicked problem of societal things to change. It's a problem of power. And we as lawyers, practicing or not, can use the power of law to shift power, to seek reparations, to change the outcome. So, so it's a man-made problem with an intersectional feminist solution. And for me, intersectional feminism is disrupting power, not accepting systems of hierarchy or working within them and having opportunities for diverse actors to have their say. So I guess my journey, I did science and law, and I just wanted to do something useful and positive. And on my father's side, I'm a Madewa woman, so I'm Indigenous to Basalaki Island in Papua New Guinea. If you think about looking at a map, you think about the southeast corner of Papua New Guinea, a beautiful little island. I brought a photo. I can't see myself for some reason, so I don't know if I'm holding it in the right spot. But
We can see you. That looks good.
this isn't actually Basalaki. This is Samurai Island, where my father and brother were born, where my grandmother grew up, where she was married to a white man through a system of essentially oppression and apartheid, where people wouldn't marry them because it was a black and white couple getting married, where with her parents, the wife could go into the dance, the husband couldn't because his skin was too dark, with multiracial families where all sorts of colors. So it gets kind of awkward when you live in that kind of segregated society. So I've grown up with these stories, and from this being from Indigenous women who are rights holders to some of the most biodiverse coral reefs in the world. And then, as luck would have it, come across people like Dr. Chris McGrath and the advocacy around Great Barrier Reef advocacy, using the law to protect coral reefs, using the law to hold the line on 1.5. So those are the kind of things that really brought me to climate law advocacy and the kind of work that I was able to do for about a decade, working at EDO and EJA, acting for groups like Doctors for the Environment, and really coming to understand that it's those groups, it's those with the courage to stand up, to put their organisations on the line, to go to court, to use the pointy tools, to mobilise their communities around questions of fairness and justice that are an absolutely important ingredient to social change. But after a decade on the tools, I was kind of the stop a Dani lawyer for quite a while. I wrote a lot of legal analysis about them, alongside a lot of other good lawyers. But, at the very pointy end of the stick, I had a fantastic opportunity to come to WWF-Australia and do what we call inside track. And that's having chats to politicians and advisors and experts, talking to all sides, being a bit more friendly, maybe running a campaign, but it's a positive and encouraging campaign. And that's just been really exciting seeing where even in that space of politics and power, it's those more diverse actors, often women leaders in the community, women politicians. If you've always got this power structure of decision making, which is white men, you tend to get more of the same decisions. I do think more diverse actors give us better decision making. Within that system of power, I was able to use my legal tools to kind of, I just treat it like strategic litigation. It's like, who are the decision makers? What are their criteria? What is my expert evidence? And what is the law? It's not necessarily the best way to campaign, but it's how I do it. And with 1 million fellow Queenslanders, because we did do a petition, I had a good day at work when we got, I don't know if you can see this, the Clean Economy Jobs Bill in Queensland. So a new Climate Act for Queensland, the first Climate Act for Queensland, which legislated emissions reduction targets of 75% below 2005 levels by 2035. And it's signed there by the Minister thanking WWF Australia for our contribution. I don't think anything could be more dry and uninspiring than 75% below 2005 by 2035. But I love those words. I love them. And the reason I love them is because it's a real world test of accountability. How much emissions are you going to reduce? And the reason I love emissions reduction targets is their whole of economy. So that's the whole of Queensland, which is a third of Australia's emissions. And then for the federal government, we ran a different campaign with more than millions of people. And it was obviously harder in the, federal space is a bit trickier than Queensland, which is unicameral. And we got a 70% reduction, well, 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. I mean, it is objectively a terrible target. It is 2 degrees aligned. It will not save us, but for the advocacy of a whole crew of people that I was able to work alongside, it would have been much worse. So that was still a fantastic win. I think in the state level, the law was relevant because we were able to say, we needed to get the target first, but when we got the bill, I was able to kind of do a bunch of legal work with other actors and say, well, look, all these other states have better laws than you should improve it. And we were able to get some improvements last minute. So it was a good little law reform win, small improvements. At the federal level, I mean, just having lawyers in the movement saying, hey guys, this isn't a statutory decision under the Federal Climate Act. This is a decision of the executive power of cabinet, and we're actually going to have to convince the whole of cabinet to get our outcome here. So I do think lawyers being able to feed into campaigns, keep campaigns strong and strategic is absolutely crucial. And you consistently see that from the work of, EDO, EJA, Ninox lawyers, Johnson Legal, Dave Barnden's outfit, I've forgotten the name of it. So it's, it's an amazing tool. It's so useful in litigation. It's so useful in policy and political advocacy. And I think that having an opportunity to be one of the diverse actors in that space, or one of the rare, Pacifica climate lawyers in Australia. There's a few of us. Yes, equity generation, love them. Also, yeah, it just gives me some unique perspectives in terms of if the climate crisis is a problem of power, our systems to solve it have to also address power imbalances. And so within our own ecosystems of law firms, legal organisations, climate campaigning communities, we need diversity. We need diverse decision making. We need women, non-binary, multiracial, First Nations people with resources, agency, decision making power, not just being invited to come and put a flower behind our ear and do a nice dance or song, which is often the tokenism that happens. I think lawyers, I'm obviously biased because I come from the legal profession and I love it, but I think lawyers inherently understand that. They understand that these are questions of, sorry, that's my alarm to tell me to quieten down, that these are questions of justice, fairness. These are structural problems. And whilst we will see and continue to see really effective climate action campaigns, and I do think they're really important, it's these questions of justice and democracy and how we organise ourselves that will actually be part of saving each other and our family and our pets and our children in the end, because they are about social cohesion. Yes, I'm really interested in that part of the work too. I hope that was somewhat useful. Thank you very much for the time to speak about my story, and always open. Here's my last prop. 1.5 to stay alive. This is one of our fans we used in an advocacy event in Canberra, asking federal ministers to do the right thing on the federal climate target decision. Thanks.
Amazing, Ariane. Thank you so much. And you're also getting emoji love far and wide. I can see lots of claps, hands, smiles. Wow, so much to dig into. The chat's quiet, so I'm going to probably frame up a first question and comment to both of you, because you've both spoken very positively about the role of the legal profession. Kate, the lawyers that were really supporting Doctors for the Environment, and Ariane, really the good work that's being done in so many aspects of the profession. but there are good lawyers working for Woodside and there are good lawyers working for Santos. And, our profession is really implicated in the climate crisis in a way that probably doctors aren't so much. Part of what Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia really wants to do is, be a broad church for all members of the legal profession, but try and also shift that dial so that we see less of a momentum going towards working for the big corporate Goliaths, and that in itself can be a way to, I guess, restore the inherent power imbalance there. So I would love to know. I'll throw to you first, Kate, what it was like working alongside lawyers that supported you, but any kind of thoughts you might have had along the way about taking on that Goliath.
Sure.
And then we'll throw to Ariane.
Yeah, sure. Having a legal team that supported me was fundamental. It helped so much to have, like, there was these three wonderful women from EDO, Jess, Ruby, and Kate, who, were always there for me and were always open to questions, no matter how silly they might seem. And certainly, from the outside looking into law, it's, like it's a world, it's another world, it's another vernacular, it's the definitions are different, the way you're speaking, your assumed prior knowledge is different, so having them help us was foundational, really made such a difference. I mean, I understood that was the case, like from in medicine, our world's different too. Like we have different words that we use in our own language and things. And so I recognized that there was that sort of similarity from a professional viewpoint. And, I just want to pick up something you said about, why do sort of the lawyers who work for Woodside and work for Santos and work for the other team, so to speak, where's their motivation? And during court, I was looking at the barristers and I'm thinking, why, how can you do this? Part of me wondered how they ethically find themselves there. And, that's a hard question to answer. I find, certainly maybe the human argument might be something to put to them. And certainly, when I see in general practice people being impacted by climate now and, what happens when there's a heat wave and patients have heart attacks and people end up in hospital, or what happens when there's an algal bloom and people are too scared to go to the beach and they get coughing and, or a fire, or all the various impacts. And so whether or not there's a way of imparting to your legal fraternity that there is certainly human health impacts, that, that this is impacting them and all the people they care about and their communities, might be a way through it. But yeah, fundamentally getting back to your question, if it wasn't for the support of EDO, we would never have been able to do it. And the fact that they, there were some hairy things along the way where, these sort of last minute challenges from, the opposite team saying, oh, if you just drop it, we'll make it all go away. We won't pursue you for costs, and just trying to like push us out, make it easy to capitulate. And so, we did have to hold on to our bravery throughout it. We did have to hold it because would have been easy. There's a few times along the way where it would have been easy to just say, okay, it's too hard, and walk off. And having people that we could have frank legal discussions with meant that we continued and ended up, having our day in court and having a crack. Yeah, that's me.
Over to you, Ariane.
I think I have some quite controversial views on this ethics of lawyering piece, just from my own experience. I think from a starting point, one of my theories I put to you all, I guess, when I spoke, is that we get better decisions when we have better diversity, and we essentially win more outcomes as social cause movements when we have better diversity. I think that the not-for-profit and sector is obviously inherently worse paid than the corporate sector. There's fewer opportunities. And what I see across the climate and conservation sector is less diversity than I saw when I was in private practice, than I see at Deloitte, than I see at the Big Four, because having the opportunity to work in lesser paid, less secure jobs in public interest environmental law in not-for-profits is inherently a position of privilege, or if people aren't privileged, it's a risk they choose to take and then they have consequences. We certainly see it in the development space and, in the kind of UN advocacy space where in my time going through, often people in those roles had the privilege to go and do internships unpaid, etc. So I have a view, and I think growing up in the coal capital of Queensland, I'm kind of funny on whether or not there's anything wrong with acting for fossil fuel companies, which would sound odd if you know me and my work. But I mean, my first job was in corporates, acting for fossil fuel companies, acting for illegal tree clearing companies. In one of the, big four, I got great skills. I learned from great people. It's made me a better public interest lawyer. It's made me a better campaigner. And I still know those lawyers, and lots of their client portfolios have significantly changed to renewables because that's what the market decides, because they're amoral corporations who are there to make money. I do still think that a lot of that work, I think it's being done more in the UK, where law students are kind of ranking corporate law firms on whether or not they act for these companies. All that kind of corporate shifting is extraordinarily useful. But at an individual level, we all just need to pay off, well, most of us pay off our HECS debts, get some good skills, like be paid enough to, I mean, if I was coming out of law school now, how would I ever be paid enough to afford a house in this housing market? So I think it's been wonderful to see the expansion and professionalisation of EDO, EJA, David's Outfit, etc., where there are more well-paid, more secure roles. It's a more viable profession for more people, especially those without kind of family money and a chunk of cash from their parents to buy a house. But I mean, I still just wouldn't. If I desperately needed money for something, I'd probably go work for a fossil fuel company if I had to. And I think that goes to the root of climate change, which is at the end of the day, we can't solve it without people having their material conditions being met: food, clothing, house, pay for your groceries. And that in the climate comms research is exactly the barrier we're having to getting more people voting for climate action. So if you think of it from that perspective, dismantling patriarchal systems of power and capitalism that exploit, acting for fairness, etc., is in and of itself climate work, because it lets more and more of us choose to spend our daily lives doing this cause work, be able to afford to do so. That's my unique perspective.
Right, can I pick up on that, Ariane? Because I do think it's a really interesting point you're making. I mean, certainly in medicine, we have like a central tenet of firstly, do no harm. So we have non-maleficence and beneficence as like central core ethical principles. But, it doesn't mean that, every doctor is this, pure as a driven snow human that never does any bad thing. I think that would be silly to say. And we are all embroiled in this system where we are dependent on fossil fuels. Our world is turning around on fossil fuels as they're so embroiled into our lives. And so we can't just click our fingers and turn them off. But so when you were talking, what I was thinking was, it sort of is almost the dare from the judgment that we had was that if, who can do something about this? And the people that can do, like, is legislation. It's like it's going back into the halls of parliament and saying, where's your ethical responsibility to create the conditions so that we're not stuck in this world where, people do have to pay their mortgage and people do have to pay their bills. Like that is an important lever arm. And I appreciate, of course, there are all the other lever arms around, concepts of equity and, yeah, social justice. But it's, yeah, I think it's an interesting point.
Well, that's generated some discussion in the chat, for sure. So, yeah, the issue of lawyers' ethics is coming through in the chat. I know Karen has a question that she wanted to pose. So off mute. There you go, KK.
Thank you. I flicked the thing before. I need big buttons. I guess mostly to Ariane, but I'm also curious, Kate, like how the organizations you work with practically prioritize giving voices and work and power to women and people from diverse backgrounds. So we Ariane first, and then I have a slightly nuanced version of that for Kate with Doctors for Environment.
Thanks, Karen. It's a great question. WWF Australia in our latest strategic plan has an underpinning commitment to inclusive conservation. So it's a slightly different language to the legal profession, but you know, one way I would describe that is decolonize conservation. So conservation and the conservation movement in Australia is inherently built from kind of, I mean, it's shorthand, but generally kind of white middle class wilderness kind of movements, not from First Nations justice movements. So, you know, some practical examples is, you know, we've got an Oceania First Voices program, which doesn't have an agenda in terms of what those, you know, people and voices will advocate for. It creates platforms, it creates events, that kind of thing. We have a lot of Indigenous experts on staff, and we ground our conservation work first and foremost in an inclusive conservation approach. We partner with Indigenous groups to support their, for example, saltwater sovereignty, their aspirations and their agency for country. And as a larger organisation, also, you know, can sometimes stay a little bit in the background, which is helpful. So yeah, there's some incredible programs at WWF Australia on that kind of thing.
You know, that's really good to know. Thank you. And Kate, at Doctors for the Environment, I'm curious to, as it's important to have women in these spaces, but also as we've talked today, it's more that it falls to women to do this work because they see the need. Do you see in Doctors for the Environment across the medical profession where you get your kind of volunteers from? Is that a majority of women? Is it people in different positions of power within the medical field? How do you see that, yeah, aligning with the medical profession?
I think, you know, Doctors for the Environment, we are mainly led by women. Like, you know, I'm a woman and our board co-chairs are both women, and we certainly have a lot of women on our board and in leadership positions within DEA, and certainly always have.
Mm.
Whether or not we do have men too, and we, you know, we do have a relative, you know, relative diversity, although I could say we could do better there. Um, I wonder what it is that draws the female doctors into this work. And, you know, when we were talking before about, um, you know, the climate crisis being an extension of toxic masculinity, there's a great analogy there for my work as a general practitioner. You know, in general practice, um, female GPs see an awful lot of domestic violence, and I have seen countless cases of intimate partner abuse in my work as a general practitioner, and was very focused on that before I got switched on to climate. And I see the analogies there all the time, you know, of the powerful group or the powerful person harming, abusing people of less power. And that when that person of less power or group of less power tries to do something about it, they're gaslit, the problem is minimized, they're lied to, they're denied, you know, the forces of power is used against the person on the receiving end, the victim or the survivor. And the amount of times I've said to survivors, you know, who are so upset about the treatment that they've received from their partner that, you know, that the partner is unlikely to have an epiphany. The partner is unlikely to go, oh, of course, I've been such a terrible person all this time. I'm not going to be that way anymore. Um, it does not happen that way. And so, you know, I think there's an analogy there with the fossil fuel industry. It would be lovely if they had an epiphany and said, oh, yeah, it doesn't have to be this way. We're going to stop. I don't think they're going to. And so I think that brings me to the second part of this point is that women being on the receiving end and women GPs particularly being very exposed to this in our work, we see it and we recognise it. And so we recognise the analogy between what we're seeing in our general practice and what we're seeing in the climate world or in the fossil fuel power dynamic world. And therefore, we know how to call it out because we're quite practiced in having these conversations with our patients and in that world. And we're quite practiced at being advocates in that world, sticking up for our patients' rights and recognising that we have a responsibility to do that. And so the people that are attracted to DEA, are kind of extending from that. They're recognising the capacity that they have, they're recognising the need and saying, all right, I've got a bit of skill set here. I'm going to use my skill set. And so it has been absolutely wonderful for me coming into DEA. And I must admit, a quick story, I started in DEA when Tony Abbott was Minister for Women because I had a moment of, I've got to do something about this. I can't watch it anymore. I've got to play. Um, that, we've seen that need and we're extending it. And you come into DEA and recognise that there are all these other people, all these other doctors in DEA who recognise it too. And it's very much a home for us that we feel a lot of camaraderie and collegiality with each other, knowing that we all recognise this problem together and are trying to make change.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
thank you. Um, yes, really interesting to hear how that works in the profession, other professions as well, and at WWF. Some other good comments just from the chat that I'll raise. Thanks, Anisha, for your point saying appreciate this discussion. Is her experience is that or your experience is largely um, it's not so much a privilege to work in the CLC and legal aid space, but it often falls to First Nations and marginalized communities to do advocacy work in spite of the personal cost, and that also the corporate type roles can be very elitist in their recruitment, which yes, Ariane, sorry, has agreed with too. And as you said, like people may either work in that field sometimes because they can work without earning as much money, or if not, it's at personal risk, which I think is where Anisha is making that really good point. And it seems like it's one of the tensions that pops up a few times here is that women are both called on to do this work, I think, through being in the space, or that people, women, and extending that intersectionally to diverse communities is they're there and they see the need because it's them and their communities, and that sometimes it's when we have a small amount of power or privilege or using what skills we can to then also use that experience to be doing the work. Um, it reminds me of one of our first movements through Lawyers for Climate Justice when the police protest laws were coming in or changing in Queensland, and it was 2019 and there were school strikes, and we were quite inspired by Doctors for the Environment at the time. 2019 people were still not really acknowledging climate change as even being linked to some of the big disasters were happening at the time. And we wanted to uh, make some submissions to Parliament. And I remember actually like breastfeeding a baby and listening to the sitting in the armchair, getting very cranky about what was happening. It was actually because it was my birthday, so I got to spend the day doing whatever I wanted. I'm going to sit down and write some angry submissions. And it reminds me of that women's work of just finding little spaces amongst looking after children and sometimes doing your day job to say, I have this little bit of power. I'm going to choose what I do today and I'm going to spend it doing some advocacy. Do we have any more questions, Chris or Mon, or anything else from the chat before we wrap up?
Um, well, there's some really great comments in the chat which people can read as we go through. I think that's a wonderful kind of space to maybe start to wrap up, Karen, that comment about, this is the practical thing that I'm going to do with the time that I have. And, we can all use the tools that we've got in the way that we can to do what we sort of must. I'm just wondering if, our speakers maybe have some closing reflections on sustaining the work, where they draw their inspiration from, and what keeps them going, which is, the moment that we've been kind of called here for. So, anything spring to mind, Kate or Ariane?
Absolutely. You know, Climate change is a massive global problem and no one person can solve it. And I'd love to be able to solve it. it wouldn't be great, if I could just wave my magic wand in the air and it'd all be better. And I think anybody who's on this call is climate alarmed and is trying to do something for their planet. And I think we have to recognize that it's all our little somethings that add up, and that if we are going to make the massive societal transformation we need to create a livable planet, we're all in it together. And so we do the one thing. And then we acknowledge that we've done it. Like, say to yourself, I did the one thing, because I do also think that, we can really feel like with Sisyphus, we're pushing this great big boulder up the hill and then overnight it rolls back down. And it's such a big boulder and you're just tired. But to go, okay, I'm doing my one thing. I wrote a letter to my MP. I went and visited. I did this talk. I tried to do some good thing. I switched to a renewable energy provider. Whatever it is, I rode my bike to work. I had a conversation with someone about climate change that was a little bit uncomfortable, but I made a difference today. I did that and acknowledge it and then go, okay, I've done my one thing, and then move on to the next one and hope that there are enough other people around there doing their one thing as well. And then if we all do our one things, maybe we'll make it. And that's kind of the mantra I live by. And I try and acknowledge what I do so that I can have enough energy to get up in the morning and just keep going. That's me.
Should I throw in another comment? Thank you. Oh, that was very healing to hear, Kate. Thank you. I think yeah, one of my a comment that was made to me by a client I had who was fighting one of the Galilee coal mines, who was doing so based in India, a really inspiring client, and just did it at great personal risk, just was absolutely there doing it even though they weren't necessarily, there was no silver bullet, we weren't going to win. And I just said, how do you keep doing it? How can you bring yourself to keep doing this? And he's like, you never know which last straw is going to break the camel's back. Just put on your straw, put on your straw, put on your straw. And that's all we can each do with the power we have. Yeah, and my daughter will grow up and she'll figure out that the reef is definitely going to die in large portions, that my great grandmother's reef is going to die in large portions. And she'll say, what did you do, Mum? And I was like, I put every straw I could on, whilst also showing up for you. And that's all I can do.
Amazing.
That is so inspiring. Thank you. I'll try to not cry before I do a vote of thanks. Thank you, Mon, for chairing and for everyone for being here. To Kate, we were truly inspired by Doctors for the Environment to start Lawyers for Climate Justice, because when you were calling it out, this is just 2019, when you're really calling out climate change as a health emergency as well. We looked around and lawyers were not in that space in that way as a profession calling anything out. And so your actions led to ours, and hopefully we've probably never told you, but thank you so much for being there because of that.
You're
And no,
very
don't make me
welcome.
cry before I finish these. And Ariane, Ariane, you've always been really inspiring too. And Ariane and I both met at a big firm in a planning environment group when we were baby grads and research clerks together. So I guess something good coming out of that work is to meet the people that stick around and you see doing that amazing work together. So thank you both to our speakers. And sorry we didn't have the full three, but thank you to everyone for being here. And we'll let you go about your day, hopefully feeling inspired and adding your straws and doing your little somethings.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody. That was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.